Sure.
Good evening, everyone. This will be a true case of delayed satisfaction, as you have to put up with me for just a few moments, and then I'll turn things over to our guests of honor. It's so wonderful to see so many of you here, both in person and online. We are gathered here, of course, to celebrate the Winnipeg launch of The War We Won Apart, the untold story of two elite agents who became one of the most decorated couples of World War II by Winnipeg's own Nahlah Ayed. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather here tonight is located in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Innuit, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, the homeland of the Red River Métis. In addition, of course, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. I can safely say you are in for a real treat this evening. We are, of course, welcoming back Nahlah Ayed to Winnipeg, and we have an incredible host here to put her in the proverbial hot seat to discuss this incredible book. We're so grateful to Viking Canada for helping to make this evening a reality, and of course, for publishing this book in the first place. Just a few quick things about the book itself. It has been the subject of incredible amounts of praise since it was published. Award-winning writer, journalist Karoloff says the whole story is true, meticulously researched and crafted by one of Canada's finest journalists. Military historian Tim Cook has said that Ayed recounts their stories with sympathy and skill, following the lives and legacy of those who sacrificed, loved, and lost during these fraught battles to liberate the oppressed. And David Stafford, the author of 10 Days to D-Day, had this to say: Nahlah Ayed brilliantly and with great sensitivity captures the demands this placed on the relationship of the characters, both then and for the rest of their lives. Thoroughly researched and well-informed, this is a human story that lingers long in the mind. A few quick notes about the procedure. There will be a conversation that'll take place to my left. We'll look inside the mystery box and see what questions you might have for Nahlah Ayed this evening. And if you are one of those watching on YouTube, please feel free to write any questions you might have into the chat, and we will put them to the author as time permits. We do ask that you please do try to limit your questions to the scope of the book itself. And now, without further ado, I have the pleasure of introducing both of tonight's participants. And I can also offer you the consolation that though the sun may be directly in your eyes at any point during this event, rest assured it will soon move on to torment someone else temporarily and eventually leave us all behind. Our host for the evening, Reg Sherren, has been introducing Canadians to the people and stories they care about for over 4 decades. Known for his unique storytelling abilities, this award-winning journalist and author has reported around the world, from the Persian Gulf, Europe, Japan, and across the United States of America. A veteran broadcaster, in his career, Sherren has worked as an investigative consumer journalist, foreign correspondent, network host, Country Canada, and documentary filmmaker. Sherren has also been the recipient of numerous journalism awards from the New York and Columbus International Film and Video Festivals, as well as the Radio and Television News Directors Association. His first book, That Wasn't the Plan, was published by Douglas and McIntyre and chosen by the Globe and Mail as a best fall read. His second book, 4 Seasons, published by Flanker Press, was released this spring. Reg and his family reside in Winnipeg, and we're thrilled that he's here with us tonight. Born in Winnipeg, Nahlah Ayed is an award-winning writer, broadcaster, and currently producer and host of CBC's Ideas. For 2 decades, Ayed worked in hot zones around the globe, from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to Russia's annexation of Crimea. Her first book, 1,000 Farewells, was a finalist for the 2012 Governor General's Literary Awards. I'm now going to ask all of you to join me in a raucous welcome for the wonderful Reg Sherren and Nahlah Ayed.
And welcome, everyone. Lovely to see so many beautiful faces out there this evening, giving us a little time on this beautiful and so far somewhat rare Winnipeg evening. Nahlah, so great to be here with you this evening. And I have to say, what a fabulous piece of work. And by the way, welcome home.
Thank you very much, Reg. It's kind of a fantasy to be sitting here next to you, to be asked questions by you. You are always a role model, such an amazing storyteller, and for me to have you here is really great.
Aw, shucks.
And I want to just get this out of the way too. I see so many beautiful faces here I haven't seen in a long time. I just saw another one, and I just feel like bawling. So just thank you for coming. It means a lot, and it's beautiful to see all of you. Thank you, all of you, for being here.
I was thinking earlier today, wouldn't it be a wonderful thing if when it came to war, we had nothing to talk about, that it had long since left our collective consciousness, and we didn't talk about war anymore, but of course we all know that isn't the case. It's been a part of our lives forever, and you have been witness to many of the modern conflicts, perhaps too many. But it's a story from 80 years ago, and we're mere days away from the 80th anniversary of D-Day that has abided with you. And maybe we should start at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
When did you first become aware of this story?
Yeah. I was based in London. I was lucky to be based in London for 7 years of my career. And part of the job description, as you know, because you were based there as well, is to mark the D-Day anniversary. And of course, the big anniversaries were even more important to really think about the kinds of stories we wanted to tell. So 5 years ago, almost exactly this time of year, our producer, Stephanie Gensler, came up to me with a few options, and she said, here's a story of this woman. And before I even heard the details, I thought, I've been in London for 7 years and I've never been asked if I could do a D-Day story about a woman, so yes, before I even knew the details. But then I learned what the details were. And I realized that I'd never heard of anything called the Special Operations Executive. I'd certainly never heard about Canadians being behind enemy lines before D-Day. And I definitely didn't know that there were women behind enemy lines in France before D-Day. And so that's how I first came about the story, and that's why I couldn't let it go, because it was just such a surprising story.
Right, Stephanie Gensler, phenomenal.
One of the best we have. Yeah.
And so you did a piece for the National.
Yep.
But the story stayed with you.
Yeah.
And was it picking away at you?
It was. I mean, it was helped a bit by the fact that it stayed with our audience too. And I had all these people write me, people of all ages, women especially, young women and older women, like, just, who is this person and why haven't we heard about her? Mm-hmm. And to me, part of the interest wasn't just about the fact that I could think about her and think, well, she's a woman. I remember being 19 or 20, and I definitely didn't jump out of a plane at that age. But there was so much more to her story, because her husband was also, in his own right, a hero and a military man who we need to talk about as well.
Absolutely.
And there was just so much more to the story, and I thought, my God, we just scratched the surface.
Well, she was a young girl that grew up in turmoil, really, family turmoil, which, as a Brit, she wound up in France, but she was, 15 years old when she was by herself crossing the channel with the thunderstorms of war brewing?
Yeah, she was 15, and she'd been tested since she was even younger, Reg. She came from a difficult childhood. Mm-hmm. There was abuse, there was malnutrition. She once ended up in hospital as a child with signs of malnutrition and neglect. But as a 15-year-old, the war was starting, and all the Brits, anyone who was British on the mainland was trying to get back home. Right. And she was among them. And she made her way from the south of France, took a several trains to get to Paris, and then had to cross, over from Calais, and it did it entirely on her own with no identification. The money she had, she spent the last of it on a croissant and a coffee at the Gare du Nord in Paris, and just using her own wits, if you can believe it. And she made it all the way to Horley, where her mother had a home, but even there, no one was waiting for her at the station. She walked 5 kilometers to actually get to the house where she was going. But it's an early glimpse into Sonia Butt's ability to operate on her own and her resilience.
And as things progressed, and she was 17 when she decided she was going to attempt to sign on?
Her actual birthday, on the 17th, on her 17th birthday. And it's a terrible time in London at the time. You know, it was, you know, a barrage of explosions.
Daily.
Daily. And a few nights before was one of the worst yet. And so she was taking a risk even just going to London to sign up, but she did. And they told her, well, you have to wait 6 months, but she still signed up anyway. And exactly on her 17 and a half birthday, they called her up. Yeah.
And yet she also had a kind of a devil-may-care attitude.
She did.
She was looking at the different arms of the military and choosing them based on
It was based on the uniform.
what she looked best in. She was a bit of a looker.
She, you know, it's funny, she tells, this is such a long story, I'll tell you just a glimpse of it. The family recorded Sonia talking about her experiences late in life. And I had the privilege of listening to those tapes. So I heard Sonia, even though she passed long ago, telling her own story, which really helped inform the book that I wrote. But so she talks about this time when she goes to London, and her father is asked, who's in the Air Force, says, well, which one are you going to sign up to? And so she goes to Moss Brothers, a clothing store, a clothiers, and she tries on the 3 uniforms and decides that the one for the Women's Auxiliary Air Force is the one that suits her best. You know, it kind of, you know, highlights her figure. But, you know, it's funny to talk about it. She laughs about it. But I looked into this, and actually it was a common way for women to decide how to join up with, you know, which auxiliary service to join, because there was a dearth of information. No one told them, well, this is what you would do if you joined up with this service or that. And so this was one of the few ways that women could decide how to join, which one to join. Yeah.
And she was described as a young girl who the camera really loved.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and she was a total tomboy too.
Yeah, and
she's a beautiful tomboy.
And so I guess in large part because of her ability to speak in impeccable French,
yes,
she attracted the attention of the SOE, the Special Operations Executive.
Yeah.
Maybe you can give people a little history lesson on Special Operations Executive, because it's not something that I knew a lot about, and yet this was the genesis, I guess, came from an idea that Prime Minister Churchill had.
Sure. And
he was bringing together. Well, you tell us a little.
I will, as long as you promise that if there's anything else historical about the Second World War, that you tackle that.
Okay.
This is the only thing I know about the Second World War. So the Special Operations Executive was formed. Some of you will remember the Dunkirk evacuations, or at least the story of the Dunkirk evacuations, when basically all the Allied forces, the British forces, had to leave France, and there was no presence on the ground. Really, the only means with which the British could fight the German occupation, which was spreading in Europe, was either by air or using sabotage,
yes,
people on the ground. And so this Special Operations Executive was formed to do exactly that. It was a secret operation that would recruit initially ordinary people who were not in uniform, who were trained to parachute, trained to blow things up, trained to jump out of planes and shoot. They learned to shoot every type of weapon that you could get your hands on, because they didn't know what they'd find on the ground where they were going. And so the very first person to be dropped into France with a wireless radio to do this was on May 6, 1941. And all through the war, they were being dropped into different parts of Europe, not just France.
And as she came along, I think, they knew D-Day was coming.
Absolutely.
And there was I wouldn't say a desperation, but certainly it smacked of desperation. We need more operatives in the field if this is going to succeed.
Yeah, 100%.
And so there she was. And they soon learned that she was actually a crack shot. She was excellent with explosives, and she was fearless.
She was fearless.
And in the middle of all this came a young French Canadian. And I like the way it was described in the book. He was called a slight, wiry thunderstorm of a man, Guy d'Artois.
Correct.
So tell us about Guy.
Okay, it's funny, I haven't talked tons about Guy because everyone wants to hear about Sonia. So this is my first kind of crack at it, so stick with me here. So Guy was 22 years old when he tried to sign up for the infantry. He was born just outside of Montreal. They rejected him at first because he wanted to be a pilot, but he said he would settle for the infantry, but they rejected him because he had a childhood illness, and they were really being picky at that point. It was only 4 months later or 5 months later that he ended up going over in 1940. And he went over not as an infantryman, not as a pilot, but as a physical training instructor. He was an agile man, and he knew how to do all kinds of things. A very strong man. He liked to fence, and he did a lot of physical things. And he was there to help soldiers who were injured to recover from injury. So the short version of the story is that eventually he goes home without having ever really seen any fighting, and then is recruited in Canada. After he had done some special work, he learned to parachute, he learned to do all these things. So he was recruited in Canada and taken to a place called Camp X. I had never heard of this place. Have you? Have you heard? Yeah, okay, someone has. But Camp X is this secret place that doesn't exist anymore, just outside of Toronto, where special forces, special operations executive and others were trained in the dark arts, so to speak. Is that the right word? Yeah.
But he displayed early on, for someone 21, 22 years old, some great leadership capabilities.
Yes.
He was cocky, he was brash.
Very much so.
And liked to fly outside the military box a little bit.
Absolutely, yeah. And he was always, he didn't like the idea of being a cog in the wheel. He really, and his leadership skills were on display very early. And so do you want me to take you there? When they met? So when they meet, he's described by the instructors who were teaching him, but others also who were sort of watching the scene as arrogant, not, as brash, loud. Sonia called him obnoxious. And he was at the time wearing a uniform with all his insignia, and she said he looked like a Christmas tree. So there was a bit of antagonism there at the beginning. They were a bit opposite in a way. I mean,
isn't there always when a boy likes a girl or a girl likes a boy? A little bit of that tension there.
And often there is a bit of what happened next, which is the teasing. They started to really physically be punishing. She pushed him into the river once. And in retaliation, he smeared her face in the mud. As they were training. So there's a lot of this documented.
And eventually, and we won't get too far ahead of ourselves, but eventually they did come together.
Yeah.
Now, before we get any further, is it fair to say that the deeper you got into the story, the more information you unearthed, the more complicated things became?
Yeah, that's a good description. Because as I mentioned, Sonia's story was the backbone, the one that she tells us on tape. And then I had to go about trying to verify some of the dates and places and names and incidents and the historical background and all of that stuff. So then I had to start going to different archival sources and then read other people's books and look at magazine articles and newspapers. And the contradictions just grew. I mean, so many different versions, so many different ideas or dates and so on.
Different names.
Different names. And it was, even in the files themselves from the National Archives in the UK, there were contradictions. And people who were on the ground wrote different stories than what they told later. So I had to, and I can't say I've come up with a completely perfect version, but I had to try to pull through and see what was the most accurate version that I could tell.
Well, my brother and I were a year and a half apart in age. We grew up in the same room. And yet our memories of what took place in our house are completely different.
Exactly.
So you'll have false memory as well that you're dealing with, right?
Yeah.
So there are all of these things.
And some of the accounts, if I may, also were written later in life, not, and so your memory changes as you go. I mean, sometimes it gets better on certain events, sometimes worse. And so some stories that Sonia told early and then later did change.
So they're training, they're getting closer, and so is D-Day.
Yeah.
And at some point, they have to make decisions on who is fit to go in the field. And they weren't exactly in love with the idea of sending her out of an airplane in a parachute, were they?
Well, she did pass the parachute training,
beyond
but
the
just
fact that
barely.
she was afraid of heights.
Yes, she was afraid of heights, and yet she did nail her. I mean, she had an average landing, and they were happy with that. But she was not well. She hadn't been feeling well. She had been losing weight. She had been suffering with bouts of illness, and so they weren't sure whether she should really be going. But their bigger concern was the fact that she was in love with Guy d'Artois. And there was, when I look at the documents, there really is a debate that happens in the documents. Should they send the two of them together? That maybe this is a good thing for the two of them, or maybe that would actually be, maybe if they break up, that would be a security risk. And so there's this debate that ensues about whether they should actually send them in together.
Sure, and even if one of them was captured, and then they use the other one as a way to extract information.
And that's what happens is that Maurice Buckmaster, the head of the F section, the French section of the SOE, brought them in after they got married, and he said, I'm sorry, we have to send you apart. So they are deployed to France separately.
Yeah.
And she says, actually, if you're not sending me in with my husband, then I'm not going. And then she watches Guy get on a plane, take off. And her boss says to her, Maurice Buckmaster says, is there anything I can do for you? Because she's very upset. She goes, yeah, send me on a mission as soon as possible. So she goes just 5 days later.
Now, the other part of the story, the twist, if you will, has a name. And his name is Sydney Hudson. While she was having her initial interest in Monsieur Guy d'Artois, another gentleman came along, a married man, older fellow, who caught her eye. Yeah. Tell us about Sydney.
Are you talking about before they left?
Before they left.
Before Guy and Sonia married, we're not quite sure what happened. Maybe a rupture, maybe a break in the relationship. We're not sure exactly what happened. But there is this other man who had just returned from France, actually, who had been in France already. And the two of them went out on a couple of dates and really hit it off until she found out that he was married. And at that point, she decided, nope, this is not for me. And within a couple of months, her and he are married, April 15th, 1944, just weeks ahead of when they were supposed to be deployed.
Exactly. So they send Guy into the field. Not long after, she's going into the field. And I mean, let's be clear about this. They weren't just eating baguettes in a back room somewhere. These people were in significant, serious danger every moment that they were on the ground.
Yeah, and I want to just pick up on something you said earlier. This time when Guy and Sonia go, the mission is very clear. It is about preparing the way for D-Day, because as you said, they knew the date. They wanted to get more weapons in, so they were parachuting weapons into the area, into France, and they wanted the fighters on the ground, the French resistants, to be trained on the weapons that were coming in. So Sonia was sitting there helping train these men how to take apart these weapons, put them back together. They had to get their
confidence.
Absolutely.
They had to convince them to follow them and to take their advice.
Yeah, and to be clear, there was already a movement, of course, of resistance on the ground, but what they were doing is helping arm them, helping train them, organize them, that kind of thing. And the risk is huge, Reg, because even by the point that Sonia and Guy are training, there are people being caught in the field. There were agents who landed right into the hands of Nazi Gestapo.
Sure.
And there were others who were actually caught alive, tortured, interrogated, and even taken to concentration camps. Canadians and otherwise. Yeah. Again, this is all news to me when I was reading about it. So even as they're training, this is happening. So the risk is huge. I think the average time that a radio operator, a wireless radio operator, was surviving on the ground was 6 weeks. Your chances as an agent of dying was 50-50.
Oh yeah.
Those were the odds they were working with when they went in.
So she parachutes in and meets up with the other operatives on the ground. And who is running this particular cell?
It's Sydney Hudson.
Sydney Hudson.
The man she dated briefly.
And so, war being what it is, eventually they, in the midst of all this danger and actually achieving quite a lot of success, as a woman, she would go in, as you mentioned, to a room full of men who are going, what does this individual know about weaponry? And in very short order, she would show them what she knew about weaponry. And she could fire, she was ambidextrous.
She was ambidextrous.
Yes, she could fire with other, and a very good shot.
Yes, she was.
Yeah.
So yeah, there was a lot of consternation among some of the fighters saying, you know, Britain must be really suffering to be sending women to help us train. And she's quoted in one of the old articles of Maclean's magazine actually saying, you know, just bear with me, I know I'm just a girl, and I'm sure once you learn how to use this weapon, you'll be far better than I am.
Well, very clever.
It worked.
Oh,
It worked.
absolutely.
She gained their respect, and in fact, they would practice, they would live practice on real convoys. They would actually ambush convoys and she would be with them. And she described some of that in the tape, and I've included that.
So in the days leading up and during D-Day, they were creating havoc behind the lines, wherever they could upset German forces and what they were attempting to do or attempting to respond to D-Day.
Yeah, so the first days, just before D-Day, the mission was to gather as many weapons as possible and to be prepared. And as soon as they knew that the Allied forces had landed, then it was trying to prevent any reinforcements from going to the front. So that was the job. So that meant blowing up trains, that meant cutting highways, that meant ambushing convoys. I mean, they did everything possible to just stop, to give them a fighting chance, so to speak, for the Canadians and Brits and Americans and French who were landing in Normandy.
Right. And I think most people, I don't know, have a sense that D-Day occurred, the Allies have landed, the German army is on the run, and from there on in, it's, you know, this short walk to the end of the war, but it wasn't.
No, not at all.
I mean, they became even more critical as operatives behind the lines as the German forces tried to respond, and it went on for months.
It went on for many months, and not to give it all away, but, you know, Guy and Sonia are there right until the fall, like right until liberation, and they are working throughout that entire time. And the roles changed. I mean, I always say people like to call them spies. They weren't spies, they were agents, because they weren't gathering information.
Right.
They were actually sabotaging and training and receiving parachuted weapons and that kind of thing. But at one point in Sonia's district, it was one of the first to be liberated. And when that happens, she starts to work with the Americans who've landed on the ground in a more spy-like role. Yeah, so she was gathering, because she could move around so easily, she was pretending to be a French woman, of course. And she had the right ID to be able to move around without any trouble, mostly. And so she traveled across lines to gather information on German forces and bring it back to the Americans.
It was actually easier for women in most cases to move amongst the German forces undetected.
Yeah.
Now, as that whole near the end, there was a story in the book where perhaps she was in the most danger she had been in the whole time. They crossed a bridge and they came back, and the German forces had retaken the bridge. Maybe you can tell that story.
Yeah, it's a very fluid situation. And I mean, in war zones, obviously, it always is. So one day they crossed a bridge. It was being held by the Americans, the area near it. And the next day when they returned, it had changed hands. And so she had the wrong ID in her hands and the wrong flag hanging out of the window. And so she was with Sydney, and they made a split-second decision. There was only one thing they could do. So he just gunned it. And they ran a gauntlet of fire. A hail of bullets. And Sydney is hit. Her jacket is riddled with holes. And they decide to ditch the car and to walk and try to find some other way of getting where they wanted to go. Except they ended up in a town where things take a much worse turn than one could imagine. And really horrible things happen there. I won't give it all away here, but yeah, it was the worst moment, I think, for Sonia in the war was after that incident.
And I found myself having to remind myself that we're talking about very young people here in incredibly tense psychological distress.
Yeah. And also, you know, with not very much training. No. I mean, Sonia had nothing to do with them. I mean, her father was an RAF man, but she had never been in the military. And in fact, some of the criticism that the SOE comes into later when we hear about the horrific losses, all these people, these young people who end up in concentration camps and who are killed and who are captured. And so the criticism comes in saying, well, what else do you expect when you send in such inexperienced people, you know, who've never been in war zones before?
Yeah, but they were, like we said, desperate. And they knew that if they were to have any chance of success, they had to roll the dice, so to speak. And these individuals were hearing about their colleagues and their fate while they were in the field themselves. It must have been an unbelievable pressure.
Yeah, Sonia talks about that. Even while they're training, and in the last phase of the training, they're hearing the stories. And it's, yeah. I mean, again, not to give away too much, but Sydney was imprisoned for 15 months in France. Yeah. The only reason he survived is there was a prison break. And this is when he comes back to London and meets Sonia. But these things were routine, especially early on, because they were still perfecting the operation and the IDs were imperfect, their security was imperfect. And so things went wrong often.
Now, we're kind of ABCing it here a little bit, but I have to say, you know, this book, it reads like a John le Carré or a Robert Ludlum. It's a thriller. It's a page turner. The way that you've written it, and you brought people inside this story in such a descriptive way and an emotional way. It's a real good piece of work, real fine piece of work.
Thank you.
Now, liberation happens, they're back, and let's face it, she and Sydney had gotten back together, but when the war was over, so was that in her mind, right?
Yes. So she decides that she's going to honor her marriage. And so when she discovers that her husband is alive, she decides to tell him as soon as possible. And so she tells him what happened. And
full disclosure. We
will never know, we will never be privy to those conversations, but somehow they found their peace and then decided to move to Canada together.
Now, that was an interesting turn in the book as well for me, because you know, normally you'd think, okay, that's the end of the story, but it wasn't for you. What made you decide to go and explore the rest of their lives?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of I should back up a bit. I think some of you who would know some of my work would know that I've always been interested in stories of war, of conflict, but especially women in conflict. Mm-hmm. And I've always maintained that the story is never really, although you might think differently when you read this book, it's never really in the combat and in the fighting and the bombs and the shooting, that it's really about what happens to the people. And so to live up to that in my own mind, but also to really see, the other thing I also always contend is that wars never really end. They change your DNA. And they change the course of people's lives, sometimes for better, mostly for worse. And I wanted to see what happened. And again, incredibly difficult, given they were no longer around, but their children are around. 6 children they had, 3 boys, 3 girls.
Yes, big family.
Big family. And you know, and we know about Guy's career because he continued in the military.
For a fellow that didn't really fit that well into the structure, he became addicted to it. He needed it. He
tried to leave the military because Sonia was hoping that he would, but it didn't last for very long. He didn't like it outside the military, so he went back in.
When I was reading this as well, because of course we have some family experience with war. My wife's dad was landed at D-Day, and those struggles that they went through in those days, they did carry with them for the rest of their lives.
100%. Yeah.
You know, always there.
Yeah, and often, and this is the other thing, is that, I mean, their children will tell you this, is that it isn't a topic of discussion, you know, as they're growing up. They're more likely to talk to their friends about their experiences, but not to the kids. Mm-hmm. And so again, I really wanted to know what it was like for them as individuals afterwards. And as you'll see when you read the book, they have different experiences, husband and wife, in how they move on from the war. But as you know, many people never really move on. It remains with them. They can never outdo things they did back then, and the memories sometimes come back to haunt them much later in life as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, you know, there's one other thing that happens after Guy has passed, but we'll save that for the book because it's a special, poignant moment. And maybe at this point, it would be a good idea to see if we have some questions from the audience. And is John around? He had the magic box full of questions.
Someone, I'm just lurking behind you. So we had a few questions. Yes, perhaps I should wander out and actually read them. So one question is, the subject matters or the subjects of the book had both passed when you came to the story. So you researched past interviews and their family histories. How did that help you to find Sonia's voice?
The past interviews, is that what you said?
That's exactly.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, I've read a couple of reviews recently that came out that said I did a better job of reflecting Sonia's voice than I did Guy's, and I think it's exactly because of that. Because I literally heard 13 hours of tape, you know, of her telling her story and, you know, laughing when she was remembering, you know, happy memories and hearing the emotion and upset when she was describing difficult events. And so I almost went with her on the journey. And what a privilege to be able to do that. I lament the fact that I could never ask follow-up questions or, you know, get her to elucidate on some of the things that she told us, I guess, through these tapes. But I think that's precisely why she comes through better. Guy, I did very, very late in my process find a bit of tape of Guy in the Bandu Museum in Quebec City at the Citadel there.
Yes.
And it was actually a recording of him doing a show and tell. He had there's so many layers to this story about documentation, but Guy had almost everything photographed. He had a camera. I mean, not many people did back then. He had it with him in the war zone. And so he had everything photographed. Like he had, you know, so that's good. And then we found this bit of tape, about an hour's worth, where he is going through the photographs and describing what's in the pictures, kind of taking us along. There was zero emotion that I could detect. So he's an enigma. I couldn't really get to know him. But at least I heard his voice and I got a bit of description.
Given that this was a story that, you know, was 80 years old, and I guess it was certainly talked about and written about not long after it happened in its own fashion, but you know, there's 50 pages? 60 pages of footnotes, and I mean the documentation, what you were able to come up with is not insignificant. And and I think I alluded to it earlier, at some point it almost may have become more of a hindrance than a help, especially when there's contradictions between the information that you're able to unearth.
Yeah. I mean, listen, it was important to me to show my sources. It's something I learned, you know, very early on from people who are sitting in this audience.
That would be you, Cecil.
Cecil and Dr. O'Kell. Sorry to out you there, but from University of Manitoba. Yeah, it was important for me to show the work because I couldn't ask questions. I mean, as a journalist, I found that bizarre. I mean, it's not quite, I'm not a historian and I've never trained as a historian, but to me, it's somewhere in the middle of the two. And I was uncomfortable. As it got closer to the role of historian, I got uncomfortable because that's not what I'm trained in. And I wanted to get to hold someone and say, well, what about this? And so I really interrogated the archives and I went back over and over and over and over and over again to try to confirm things.
And you had some great research assistants as well, right?
Oh God, I mean, there's some amazing people who helped me out. I mean, I can do some shout outs, but yeah. One thing I will say is we found this is the extraordinary thing about people who go through extraordinary things, is that there is this compulsion always to want to record, of course, what you do. And I found, thanks to Michel Gagnon, another wonderful CBC producer, found memoirs, parts of memoirs, diaries, snippets of information, people who fought with Guy in France. And so we went to France, and thanks to the families there who shared those documents with me, which was so touching. I mean, these things that some of which are online, some of which are just literally scraps of paper, and I was able to use those to cross-reference with this one.
And even Sydney Hudson had an unpublished manuscript.
Sydney, yes, exactly. He actually wrote a real book, which was published, and he'd had Sonia look at it,
Right.
you know, later. Anyway, I just gave you my
There you go.
Yeah.
John?
So another question that we have is, as a journalist, did you draw similarities between Sonia's experiences in the war and your own experiences as a reporter in conflict?
I think it's hard to find exact parallels, of course. We have very different roles. But obviously being in a war zone as apparently a civilian in her case, and as an actual civilian in mine, there is some parallel there, I suppose. I think what I brought from my experience is an idea, just some idea what it might sound like in a war zone, what it might feel like in a war zone, what it's like, what the scene looks like. Wasn't there in the Second World War, so it's a bit different in my day, but still, what the terrain looks like when an army is withdrawing. What it's like to land in a country and know that you can't easily leave anymore. You're stuck there and there's war happening around you. So I tried to bring some of those thoughts, you know, that I, of course, went through my mind, and the knots in your stomach when you land in a place and know you can't get out. So I tried to bring some of that to bring alive what it might be like for Guy, for example, landing in France, or what it might be like for Sonia, you know, to be driving across enemy lines.
You know what it's like to be in danger.
I know what it's like to be in danger. Yeah.
So there was a question that moves a little bit beyond just the book, but to your role as an author. So what has been the most impactful change for you between international reporter and being the voice and heart of ideas and your current role as an author as well?
I didn't hear the nub of the question. What was that?
Well, of course. So what has been the most impactful change for you between international reporter and being the voice and heart of ideas and published author?
Most impactful. I mean, boy.
A story is a story.
A story is a story is a story. I would say a physical change, the change in venue. Being abroad for 20 years and then coming home. I mean, I couldn't do this before, so it's impactful in that way. So personally impactful in that I get to be home. I am home in Canada. But in terms of the work, yeah, stories, I would say that it's nice to be able to tell longer stories, more in-depth stories, because abroad, my biggest frustration, that's what got me to write my first book, is that the stories were so short. And I'll probably get fired for this, but I'll tell it anyway. But one of the last stories I did was actually, of all places, in Mozambique. And it was a cyclone in 2019. I don't know if you guys remember that, but I remember the show at the time was tight for time. And I remember calling with a satellite phone, which we didn't use very often anymore. And I said, can I just get 15 more seconds? And I took 2 minutes and 15 seconds. I said, I just need 15 more seconds. You know, I'm a writer. I like to play with words, and they're like, no. Because, you know, constraints of the show, but for me, who likes to go on, as you can tell, I just like to go on and write longer stories.
They were wrong. They should have given you the 15 seconds. I remember those conversations, and I didn't like them either.
Yes, it's true. But anyway, for someone who likes to write longer stories, I'm in a better place right now, I think. Yeah, I'm where I belong, I think.
Yeah. And so there is, speaking of coming home as well, there's a photo of Guy stationed in Rivers, Manitoba. Was the Manitoba connection something you were aware of when you started to research?
Thank you for asking that question. I actually made sure I brought some notes about that, because I was not aware actually of the Manitoba connection, but I did through my research learn, and I never remember the name of the group. It's called the Canadian Joint Air Training Center in Rivers, Manitoba. So shortly after Guy and Sonia moved back, they first go to Montreal, which makes sense. That's where Guy's mother is. That's where they have their first child. And then suddenly Guy is deployed to Rivers, Manitoba. And so Sonia, Guy's off and running to his assignment, and it's up to Sonia, who's pregnant again, to pack up and move her family from this place she barely knew, Montreal, just outside Montreal, to Manitoba. And home became the Shiloh base.
And she actually, once she settled in, enjoyed it.
She loved Shiloh. It was some of the most fun she'd had in Canada, but when you can imagine when she first landed, it was not familiar looking terrain. And there was not even like a place for married couples to live. So they had to, really, it was a very makeshift way of starting their life there, but she ended up loving it. But so that's the big Manitoba connection. In addition, this is an amazing chapter in Guy's life. He ends up working for another, while he's doing this, he ends up working for the Canadian Special Air Service, which doesn't have an exact role, but it does kind of these difficult assignments, one of which was for him to go up to the Arctic and help save, I don't know, some of you might remember the story, Canon Turner, who was an Anglican missionary who had accidentally shot himself up north. And so this was a daring rescue that Guy led with, I think, 3 or 4 other men, which took several months to undertake, but they managed to evacuate him finally under great duress. And they evacuate him here to Winnipeg. And the connection is throughout his time there, again, Guy d'Artois, the chronicler, he had his camera, and he was writing descriptions of the work they were doing, and they were being printed on the front page of the Winnipeg Tribune. So he like first-hand accounts of what he was up to. They're talking about what it was like working with, sleds and having to find a landing place, a landing strip for the airplane, and how they were going to evacuate this man over here. So Winnipeg was riveted. Actually, the whole country was riveted if you go back to the archives and see the covers. So those are some connection points. Yeah.
And we do have 2 more questions. So the first was, how much of your research was informed by retracing their history in Europe, in UK and France? Was it tracing the history that led to the research?
Was it tracing the history that led to the research?
Or how much of your research was informed by retracing?
So you physically went to a number of these locations to
I
experience
did.
it yourself.
Yeah, so there were 2 parts to that. One was physically going to the locations. I went to the church where they were married. I went to that little house in Le Mans where Sydney and Sonia were staying. I went to the area where Guy landed by parachute in the middle of the night. Of course, with the help of the family who had been and done these trips as well. And then also virtually, but also with the help of researchers, went to the National Archives in the UK, to the Imperial War Museum, to the Vincent Archives in France, to the Library and Archives Canada, this is in Canada. So there were lots of places, important places to their history that I needed to go to. So 5 years, and of course the pandemic both helped and didn't help. The research had to be squeezed into a couple of weeks of travel, but sitting in front of a computer and not having much else to do also helped me find a lot of things online. Yeah.
And so the final question is also one of those questions that any author dreads to receive, so I apologize in advance. But also, you had made mention to the compulsion that came with researching and writing this story. Is there any particular compulsion that is twigging you right now that might lead to a new book?
Like she's going to let that out of the bag.
I thought I'd make it easy and just say no. No, somebody asked me the other day, it's been 5 years of writing and working on this and holding down a full-time job and not coming to Winnipeg and not traveling and not having fun and all those things. So I don't intend to do anything anytime soon. But this place, this kind of writing is my natural place, I think. So I'd love to do more, but not right now. Yeah.
Now, maybe we should throw it open if there's anybody that didn't get to the little magic box that would like to ask a question. Now's your time. John will bring the mic to you if you'd like to.
Perfect. And we would just ask that the questions be limited to the scope of the book itself.
Okay.
I'm just about to break the rule of the scope of the book. I apologize in advance. Having been out of the country for so long, I'm just kind of curious about a generation of people who lived through World War II and have passed away, and what we might be losing as a country in terms of mutual civility and our culture and our political relations with each other. Thank you.
Well, I mean, you hit the nail on the head for part of the reason that I wanted to write this book, is that the world that I grew up in, that I opened my eyes to, so, younger people, different world, but the one that I grew up in was the world that generation built. And so I felt both duty-bound and curious to want to tell the story and to preserve it, but also to get to know it. Because I don't know that even in all the time that I lived in this city and, was raised by this city and by people who had been through the war, both here and abroad, I don't ever remember talking to anyone about what it was like to survive it or what they did. And so I think what I've talked about is that we are living kind of at an inflection point in history where things are changing. The world order is changing. People use the word crumbling. I'm not an expert. Not the word I would use, but it's changing. It's changing dramatically. I think it's important for us to learn what underlay some of what built the world that we knew, and make the decision of what it is we want to preserve of that and what we want to throw out. Because it is ultimately up to all of us. I know it's hard to believe, but it is. And so I think for me personally, I was curious about learning more about what made that generation, and especially because, they're no longer with us mostly. So I don't know if that answers that, but those are my thoughts.
And we do have one more question for this. So this will be our final question for the evening.
Could you describe how Sonia escaped?
How she escaped?
She escaped captivity in the Germans? She was actually captured at one point, but I've always wondered how she escaped.
Yeah, well, there is a story, thank you for raising that. There is a story that actually I did not include in the book because I couldn't verify it. But there is a story out there, it's included actually in one of her obituaries, where she was captured while she was moving behind or across lines, and kept her there for hours while they tried to verify her story. And that the reason they let her go is that really the Americans were coming close and they really lost interest in the people they had held, and they didn't want to waste the time verifying her ID. But I didn't include it in the book because I couldn't verify it. I only had that one source for it. So I don't know is the short answer. I'm sorry, I wish I knew a bit more.
I believe this lady had a question as well. If we could just let her have her last question.
Oh, of course.
No, sorry, behind you. Sorry, thank you.
Hi, it's Nahlah.
Hello.
I read your first book.
Thank you so much.
And I was very surprised. You're a very brave woman.
Thank you.
And with this book, with your comments tonight, you're right. They don't talk about what happened in the war. My dad was in World War II, and he never really spoke about it.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing he spoke about was getting wounded.
Yeah.
And he came home. And my mother also was in London during bombing with my oldest brother. I'm as young as 6. So the thing is that she came across, but she had to stay in the room with it dark because they didn't want to see any light. And she could hear the bombs going around her. So I bought your book. I'm going to sit down and read it.
Thank you.
And it came out at a very good time with D-Day coming up next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that comment. And you give me an opportunity to say something I like to say, I have been trying to say at every one of these, is that it's true that generation mostly is gone, but the memories are still around. I mean, you just recounted one of them. And by the way, I mean, that's one example of the Second World War, but this whole country, I mean, if you look back far enough, almost everybody in this country can say that their family has intersected with some kind of conflict or some kind of challenging time or war or something like that. And I think it's incumbent on us to record those experiences. Even if you didn't firsthand go through them, or if you have someone who remembers, we need to write these stories down. They're part of the history of this country and they help inform us. They tell us who we are. Like, it's important.
Well, I've had the same experience many times, telling stories. One gentleman who I took back to England to find the Wellington bomber, that he was one of the only survivors from that crash. His kids knew nothing about any of it. And they were, why is this CBC journalist in your kitchen, Dad? Like, what's going on? Well, let me tell you what happened to your father. And they had no idea. He had never spoken about it, but we will remember them.
Yeah, we need to remember them. All of them.
So I think we're gonna move into the portion of the evening where Nahlah signs books and you get your Christmas gifts and your birthdays and. So, I'm sorry, did you have? Okay, all right. And I'd just like to thank you so much. It's an impressive piece of work.
Thank you.
You can see the amount of research that went into this, and the writing is phenomenal.
Thank you so much, Reg. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Nahlah. Thank you so much, Reg, and thank you all for your attention and for your questions. So we are now going to be moving along to the signing portion of the evening, as mentioned. So what I will do is just ask you all to please just remain in place for one moment, because we do need to ensure that we can get Nahlah safely to the signing table so the signing can begin. So my colleague Angela will escort Nahlah over to the table right now. And I have some procedural notes for you in the interim. So we do have copies of the book available at the signing table. We also do have copies of the book available at our cash desk. Please do feel free to get a copy of the book signed before you pay for it, but please do pay for the book before you leave. We do trust that you can spell your own name, but we will be wandering down with Post-it notes to write your name on it, just so you can spend more time when you get to the table talking rather than spelling. So thank you all so very much for coming here tonight. We could not be more happy to have you all here, both physically and virtually, and we're so incredibly grateful to Viking Canada for helping to make this evening a possibility. I'm going to just very humbly ask you to allow me to also exit the atrium before you leave, so I can actually get the signing set up. But for right now, what I would like you all to do is offer a very warm round of applause to our wonderful host, Reg Sherren, and of course to Nahlah.